really pleased to have such a large audience this morning for the second stage of Australian Perspectives on Infrastructure, which is a really fascinating piece of community-facing research from the Institute for Infrastructure in Society, together with our friends and partners at Voconiq, who've been working with us on this really exciting project. Many of you will have heard from us last year as we delivered the results of our national survey, which had some 3,500 participants from right across Australia. Now, this is the second stage of this project. And what we've been doing is talking to community members, more than 1,600 of them, in some of Australia's most impacted and most infrastructure intensive locations. So the data from that is really exciting. And I would like to take a moment, firstly, to acknowledge, before we get started, the traditional owners of the country on which I'm broadcasting from this morning, which are the Wurrua, and their elders past, present and emerging, and to give you the opportunity to do the same from the country on which you're attending from this morning as well in the chat, if you would like to. Also, I would like to acknowledge the partners who are so integral to the work that we deliver at I2S and who are supporters of our flagship research program, the Next Generation Engagement Program. If we could perhaps just move the slide. I don't think I can do it, Sarah, I'm sorry. So we do have our major partners with us this morning: the Queensland Government, the Government of South Australia, the Victorian Government, IAP2, Lend-Lease and Transurban, together with a number of our supporters who've been working with us on this. And I know many industry organisations joining us as well. So it's fantastic to have the entire infrastructure and engagement value chain represented in the room. We do encourage questions and we would love you to ask them in the chat, or I beg your pardon, sorry, in the Q&A, so that we're able to get through as many as possible. And as per our usual protocols, anything we don't get through, we will attempt to answer for you in the follow-up correspondence that comes after today. I'd like to introduce my fellow panellists, or the panellists. I'm the moderator, so I'd like to introduce our panellists for this morning. We have, of course, Professor Sara Bice, who will be well known to many of you. Sara leads our work at the Institute for Infrastructure in Society and is one of the world's best known and acknowledged authors on social license to operate. She has been part of this work since 2015, I think now, Sarah. We've been delivering this work together. And so we really appreciate you being here and providing that overarching picture of how today's results connect with the other work that we are delivering. And great to see you in your Canberra office. How nice to be out of lockdown and travelling again. Dr. Kieran Moffat is the CEO and co-founder of Voconiq. He and Sara have been collaborators together in the area of social license for many years now. And we've been delighted to be able to bring the expertise of Kieren and his research team together with our own for Australian Perspectives on Infrastructure. So welcome, Kieren. It's fantastic to have you. Donna Groves will be well known to many of you. Donna is the founder of the National Community Engagement for Infrastructure Forum, as well as the driving force behind Comic-Con, and a very, very experienced engagement practitioner. And she's going to be talking to us later today about the practical implications for engagement practitioners from the results that we're seeing. And Jonathan Cartwright, welcome Jonathan, is joining us from Infrastructure Australia this morning. Jonathan leads their their policy and research function, and in particular has been looking at market capacity, which I think you'll agree when you see the results from the work today. There are certainly some interesting correlations between the pressure that communities are experiencing and the pressure that the industry is under in this time of unprecedented delivery, where we do have some $290 billion worth of projects currently being planned and delivered across Australia. So exciting times. I don't want to take up too much time this morning. I'd love to hand over to Sara to start talking us through some of the bigger picture things that we're seeing and the context that we're delivering in this information in. Welcome, Sara.
Kirsty, thanks so much. And thank you everyone for being here. It is wonderful to welcome our panelists and attendees. In today's presentation, we are going to be walking you through the context of the data that we're providing. And let me just get rid of some things that may be creating a shadow on your screen there. Terrific. So we are working here with Voconiq, one of Australia's leading social research firms. They are a CSIRO spinoff, and as Kirsty mentioned, Dr. Kieran Moffat and I have been working together on issues of social license to operate around major projects for quite some time. And the results that we are presenting today are part of our Australian perspectives on infrastructure work. And this work comprises a suite of surveys. Late last year, we announced the findings of our national survey of just over 3,500 participants from around the country, looking at how they feel about infrastructure delivery, the role that they believe it might play in post-pandemic socioeconomic recovery, the ways in which they expect to be engaged when major infrastructure is being developed and delivered in their local regions, and a variety of questions around community resilience and well-being to really attempt to get a snapshot for how things are going for the general Australian public as we look towards infrastructure being a major lever for economic stimulus and socioeconomic development in pandemic recovery. The second and exciting component of the Australian perspectives on infrastructure work is what we are presenting today, a series of 9 locally targeted surveys in key metro, regional, and rural areas throughout Victoria, Queensland, and New South Wales, with South Australian data to come. So don't feel left out, SA, we will get to you. But we do have results today from 9 surveys and more than 1,600 respondents in heavily infrastructure intensive impacted communities in Queensland, Victoria, and New South Wales. And what we're starting to see here from this data is a really important picture about the ways in which Australians are being impacted by our current delivery, and also their expectations, challenges, hopes, and opportunities for future delivery. This work is really timely and it's really important right now. So we undertook these surveys late last year. We know the federal budget has just come out and announced $17.9 billion for new infrastructure investments. This is predominantly road and rail. These initiatives are attempting to address spiraling costs of living. When I got in my Uber from the airport this morning, the driver was telling me all about his experiences, his lived experiences of the spiraling cost of living in Canberra. And we're seeing infrastructure investment as just one economic stimulus lever in an attempt to ease pressure on Australian communities. And as Kirsty mentioned, this now takes our infrastructure pipeline nationally to more than $290 billion. But as Jonathan Cartwright from Infrastructure Australia, I'm sure will iterate later today, it also means that we have a market capacity that is under pressure, particularly in our rail sector. The work that we're presenting today, Australian Perspectives on Infrastructure, is our national community-focused survey. But since 2017, the ANU Institute for Infrastructure and Society has also run Australia's largest study with infrastructure professionals focused on better understanding the issues around community engagement, social license to operate, and social risk management for major projects. The State of Infrastructure and Engagement Survey is now entering its 5th year of data collection. And in just a few weeks' time, we will be presenting the results from our 4th annual survey. And here today is just a little teaser, a little snapshot of what year on year is our kind of hero graphic, where we ask professionals in the infrastructure sector, where you experience projects that were delayed, canceled, mothballed, or delivered but not as originally intended, what would you say are the most impactful factors for those projects? And as you can see here, year on year and again in 2021, our respondents have told us that stakeholder and community pressure, regulatory and planning issues, including policy backflipping, and project funding are the top 3 most impactful factors influencing on time, on budget project delivery. And when we look at the community data today and we start to see what communities are feeling in terms of cumulative project impacts, of the stakeholder and community pressure that they feel because of their trust in government and because of the experiences that they're having, we can really see a marrying up of the professional perspectives about what's affecting project delay. And for the first time, data that evidences that this is happening in communities and it is reflective of what communities are feeling. We know that communities are experiencing continued pressure, that even though we'd all love to be out of the pandemic, we are still experiencing uncertainties. And now with the geopolitical situation globally and supply chain issues, there are financial, time, and emotional pressures. The community data that we're going to present today, and I'll turn over to Dr. Kieran Moffat in just a moment, it suggests to us when we look at it as a whole that Australian communities who are intensively impacted by infrastructure delivery are feeling overwhelmed and unheard. The majority of community members in our surveys, including the national survey, report that they feel that projects are overly politicized and they don't necessarily address priority community needs. Instead, they may be used for political announceables. In our program of work, we're also very interested to better understand what it means for Australia to be experiencing its most intensive infrastructure delivery in history. And so we look at what we call cumulative impacts. These are the layered impacts of one locally, geographically located community experiencing multiple projects at once. And those yellow bars from industry professionals in our latest State of Infrastructure and Engagement survey are people saying that they do agree that cumulative impacts are affecting stakeholder experiences. And they also demonstrate that the professional organizations across the infrastructure who are tasked with addressing these issues have a really strong awareness that this is something that needs to be addressed, and that we do need to move beyond a traditional project by project approach, both to impact management and also community engagement. So the professionals are telling us they recognize cumulative impacts as important. And today we're going to hear how community members are reporting experiencing those impacts. So I'm going to hand over now to my very good colleague, Dr. Kieran Moffat, who kindly is joining us from his holiday. So Kieren, I hope you're in a beautiful location and we appreciate that you are here with us today. And I will click through the slides whenever you tell me to.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and g'day everybody. Really great to be with you, coming from my beautiful home office. Really excited to be able to share these results today. So we've got about 20 minutes. We're going to walk you through some of the findings from this data set. And what you appreciate as we go through is that this is a very narrow slice of the data. There is incredible richness in this data set. And what I wanted to do is just to provide you with a couple of key components of it that'll help to see the conversation to come. So we go to the slide. Yeah, I think that's right there. So this program of work was focused very locally, and of course it operates in cooperation with that national piece of work that we've done. We're going to do a little bit of comparison there between national and local. We recruited a sample of community members into this process using a very grassroots campaign. So social media, paid advertising on social platforms, pumping networks, and really getting the open invitation out into those communities where this kind of infrastructure development is taking place. Really want to hear from people who are experiencing this firsthand. In that process there, we collected really good samples from metropolitan areas, regional areas, over 700 from each of those, people from each of those areas, 9 locations across the country, and then also about 100 people from rural areas. That's smaller, you know, as you might imagine. Does make some comparisons with rural areas a little difficult, but actually it's a good spread. And as we get deeper into analysis in the weeks to come, we'll be pulling apart those stories in more detail. Good spread across geographies as well, over 500 from New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, and giving us really good confidence in the stories that we're seeing emerge from this data. Okay, so as Sarah said, South Australian data to come in as we go, but what do we measure? In designing this survey instrument, what we're wanting to really do is to kind of start with community members' perspectives about themselves, their capacity to manage change, their resilience in the face of change, and then start to drill down into more general attitudes towards infrastructure development, the sorts of factors that influence their support for a project, the role of politics in development, something that Sarah just touched on as she walked through her component, and then getting into some of the features, some of the qualities, the characteristics of different consultation methods used in the delivery of new projects. We then really wanted to narrow down into experiences of local projects. And so we provided participants with a list of projects that are happening in their area. So we used some smart logic in the survey instrument so that only those projects came up that were in the local areas nominated by their postcode. So in a list of 103, you know, people in, say, metropolitan Melbourne might have got 20 projects that they could choose from. They could choose as many as applied for them, and why I'm really stressing that is that comes through really clearly as a key point to take away from this work as we go through this. We explored experiences of those specific projects and then got into some really interesting relational pieces here. So distributional procedural fairness in particular important in this context. Do people feel that they get a fair share of the benefits that flow from the projects that are being developed in their area? And also, are developers responsive? Are they showing procedural fairness in the way that decisions are made about the design and nature of impact mitigation, for example, as those projects are delivered? We looked at impacts experienced and then key outcome measures. So trust in infrastructure developers to act responsibly, and also acceptance of projects, which is our proxy for social license, if you like. On to the next slide, thanks. So we've kind of tried to drill down here, and here's a high-level summary of results that are coming out of these local surveys so far. So first of all, we're going to be showing you some trust models. These are models that effectively define the recipe for social license at a local scale for infrastructure development. We'll be contrasting that with the national model that we developed from that national survey, and exploring some of the differences together. We did see some subtle differences in the responses of people that live in metropolitan, regional and rural areas. However, the overwhelming theme here is that those models across those different geographical areas are remarkably consistent in their nature. The same things are important that drive trust in developers and acceptance of development projects in each of those locations, pretty much. What we also see is that trust in developers is actually pretty low. So there's a lot of room to improve there. So trust in developers to act responsibly, act in the best interest of local communities, that's low and there's room to improve. Whereas acceptance of those projects is a little stronger, still with some good room to move there and improve. But I think in general, the story is this is a really great baseline from which to improve through the deployment development of the types of frameworks that the ANU team have been working on through the NextGen partnership. And then finally, I'm going to show you some really great, clear evidence for the effect of cumulative impacts. And that is really the take home for me from this work to date. So let's jump in. And as always, drop questions that you might have into the Q&A section, and I'll try and keep a track of those as we go as well. Okay, so this is the trust model from the national level survey that we did. So the framing for this piece of work was infrastructure development at the national scale, and how people were feeling about that. What this model describes is the way that a bunch of stuff measured in the survey all fits together in people's minds to predict acceptance. And the first thing to note here is that trust sits very centrally in this model, that the experiences and expectations of infrastructure development influence acceptance via trust for the most part. That is, trust acts as a vehicle that translates those experiences and expectations into acceptance. And so this is a really important policy and engagement question, shifting the conversation from how do we build acceptance or how do we avoid rejection, might be another way to frame that, to how do we build trust. It's a very different question to answer, a much harder question to answer, and that is really the point of this kind of work, which is, well, what do we need to be doing? What levers do we need to be pulling as a community of stakeholders in this space to influence trust and acceptance for nationally significant and important activities? Okay, so the key drivers of trust in this model here are the regulation, so confidence that there is regulation in place that ensures developers do the right thing and that there are penalties in place to keep developers inside the parameters of that regulation. So the more confident people are in that regulation framework, the more trust they have in the developers themselves and the more acceptance there is of the projects that they are working on. Second strongest driver here is procedural fairness, that as developers are more responsive to community concerns, they're listening actively to those concerns and taking action based on those concerns to reshape projects to make them more sympathetic to context or to demonstrate how community input is shaping those projects. The more they trust developers, the more they accept development. Those two drivers really stood apart. There were two others that are important here and significant, but just at a lower level. And they were that community has agency in the conversation, so self-determination, and that there are local benefits for the development of these infrastructure projects. So a value proposition for those people, if you like, and also that the development has positive impacts on the local economy. So this is an empathetic response. This is community members at a national scale saying, hey, those local communities really should derive some benefit from these projects as well. And I think this is important at the national scale, because what we're seeing here is that the way these projects are being developed is being observed by the electorate, by the constituency, by community members, and seen through that lens. And then finally, there are some straight line drivers of acceptance in this national model as well. That infrastructure is an important component of our COVID-19 recovery, so the investment, that's really great to understand. It's not influencing the relationship that developers have with community, but it is important for its acceptance, and that development delivers value. So that's our national level model. If we jump into the outputs from our local level data collection, we see some similarities here, but also some differences. So first up, just to explain what's happening in a model like this, these are the raw outputs from a path analysis. Within each of these boxes are a collection of the questions that we used in the survey, and we work out how they clump together, that they're measuring the same thing, and then we use that in this kind of modelling to understand how it all fits together and works to inform acceptance of development projects at a local scale. Now, the arrows tell you the direction of the effect. So more trust leads to more acceptance. And then the numbers on each of those arrows tell you the strength of the effect, the strength of the relationship. So the higher the number, the stronger the relationship. So for example, a trust in government, which I'll get to in a second, at 0.35 is a really strong driver of trust. It's more than twice as big as regulations. And so you can safely say that it's twice as important in terms of predicting and driving trust in developers as regulations is. The other thing to note is that the blue arrows are positive, so more of one leads to more of another, and the red arrows are negative in their nature. So the extent to which people feel that the community doesn't need development, that has a relationship to acceptance that is negative at 0.10, which means that the more that community members feel that development isn't necessary, the less they accept development projects. So let's jump into what the story is here. So the number one driver of trust in developers at a local scale is trust in government to act responsibly. That's really interesting. So this is effectively saying that trust in government to act responsibly, to do the right thing in this space, is a precondition for trust in developers to act responsibly. And that then leads to greater levels of acceptance of development projects. So I'll bring that back up as we go, because we've got some really interesting insights around politicization to show you as well. The second strongest driver in this model is transparency of developers. So are they operating in a transparent way? Do local communities feel like they can see into the process, into those companies, and understand how they're doing their business, how they're making their decisions? The next thing is responsiveness to feedback. So do local community members feel that those developers are listening to them, are taking their feedback on board, and using it to shape sympathetic design of projects and to account for the needs and impacts on local community members? The more responsive they feel those developers are, the more they trust them. And then finally, regulation. So the extent to which community members are confident in those regulatory frameworks to protect their interest as citizens, the more they trust developers to act responsibly. So we can see here it's a really interesting mixture of the larger framework that sits around development and the behaviour and activities of developers themselves that really drives trust in developers to act responsibly. I think this is particularly interesting in the context of the 24% number from that stat that slide that Sarah presented earlier as barriers or major influences on project delays being regulation. So this is just showing that regulation is a really important component of community confidence, not just something that's a problem or a challenge for developers. It's something that community members lean into as a way of understanding that their needs, their interests are being represented effectively in the conversation about the way development takes place. What we can also see is that information provision is an important straight line driver of acceptance itself, that people want more information in the future about these development projects. And we'll also show you that as well. So keeping people informed as well as engaged directly in the process is really the key takeaway here. They aren't substitutions for each other. Now that's our recipe for social license to operate. And what we're going to do now is to jump into some of the deeper findings. If we just kind of move to the next slide. Here we start to really pull apart the cumulative impacts of development in local contexts. Now, what we've got here, let me just explain what's going on in these graphs. So each of the columns represents the level of agreement or strong agreement with the questions or the items that are underneath each of these graphs. Each of the columns represents a different slice of our data set. Now, the blue column on the left represents those people in the sample that reported having one infrastructure project ongoing in their local area at the moment. The second column are those people that said they had 2 or 3 projects being developed in their area. The next column is those that reported 4 to 6 projects happening in their area. And the yellow column there, the orange column, are those that reported having 6 or more projects happening in their area. So first up, what you're going to see here is some really consistent systematic effects for number of projects or the amount of activity happening in the local area where these community members are living. And what we're going to see here is also some effects of threshold effects that we see. So around those number of projects as well. So let's start with the left. Infrastructure developers operate in a transparent way. Now we remember from that model in the previous slide that transparency in the way that developers do their business, it was the second strongest driver of trust in developers to act responsibly. And what we can see here is as the number of projects in a local area grows, as those projects layer on top of each other, the level of perceived transparency in the way that those operators do their work declines systematically across a number of projects. It's a really clear pattern. It's really unusual to see a pattern quite so clearly as that. This is really interesting and important in the context of trust drivers. The next one we can see here, regulations ensure infrastructure developers do the right thing. Another strong driver of trust in developers. And what we can see here is the emergence of what we might think about as a threshold effect. So you can see that the first 3 columns, so for those people that experience between 1 and 6 projects, it's really not a lot of difference in ratings on that item. Whereas when we get to those experiencing 6 or more projects in their area, we see agreement really drop away there. So the confidence in regulation to protect their interests really drops away at that point as that load increases on community members. The next one, my community has generally had positive relationships with infrastructure developers. We see the same sort of effect, that once we hit that 6 or more project level, the amount of goodwill and positive interactions really drops away in terms of agreement with that question. So I think we're starting to see some real thresholds emerge here, and really brought home clearly in the next graph here, which is that there is good overall planning for the future of my community. You can see that those ratings improve across the number of projects from 1 to 6. And then when we hit 6 or more, it dramatically drops away. So it feels like community members are seeing that as more projects are coming into play in their local area, that the level of planning really ramps up, that's clear to them. They can see how those projects fit in until you hit 6, and then it really just dramatically drops. So it feels like that is a threshold for capacity of community to cope with change. And that's interesting because that item is taken out of our resilience measures. So that's one of the ways that we look to measure resilience within a community. The next slide, please. All right, so on these ones, we're looking at information provision, preference and received. And what we can see here is as the number of projects grow, the appetite for information really grows as well until you get to about 4 projects, and then it levels out again. But effectively, most people in this sample, so 67, 65% for those areas with larger amounts of project development, are really saying we want a lot of information about these things. We want to be informed. And on the right-hand side, you can see the proportion of people that agreed with the statement that they had received communications from projects, or the amount of communication that they had had. And that grew. Once you hit 6 or more projects, the cumulative effect of those projects also led to a larger amount of information coming to community members. If we go to the next slide now, we will get into these items that are around the factors that inform, some of the factors that inform support of a project. So developers of these projects are prepared to make changes in response to community concerns. So this is a measure of our procedural fairness or responsiveness of developers. And again, we can see a little bit of a threshold effect here, where for those that are experiencing lower numbers of projects, we see more agreement that developers are prepared to take their views into account. But then with larger amounts of projects, that's significantly lower. So 20% effectively agreeing with that statement at that point. I understand how the planning process for development works. You can see there's a clear linear relationship between number of projects, and perhaps this is just repetition as that process is described over and over. As the number of projects increases, familiarity with that process increases as well. But the one I really want to focus on here is the far right graph, which is that politics influences infrastructure spending in my community. And what you can see here is a clear linear effect, almost a systematic effect of cynicism, that as the number of projects increases, the amount of politicization perceived by community members grows systematically as well, where for those people experiencing 6 or more projects, the proportion of people agreeing that that has been politicized is really very significant. And then onto the next slide, thank you. What we see here are some of the impacts that people perceive as a result of project development in their local area. And what we can see here again is the effect of threshold. So when we're looking at changes to the feel of the local area, you can see once you hit sort of 4 projects that things increase and then hold steady pretty much. But there is a jump from 1 to 2 projects. The same is the case for environmental impacts. You can see that where there's 1 project, 60% of people agreed that there are environmental impacts from those projects. But then when you get to 6 or more projects, it's 80% of people. So a clear difference there, cumulative impact from the number of projects that are ongoing in their area. And then finally, impact on local residents after completion. So for example, when an asset is in operation phase, you can see that when there are many more projects going on in an area, the amount of agreement with that statement around being impacted increases as well by about 10%. So 10% more people agreed with that statement when they had more projects going on in their local area. And now finally, this last slide really now just speaks to some of the conditions that underpin good engagement. So these are some of the qualities or characteristics that people want from engagement activities around development activities in their area. And you can see clear linear relationship between a number of projects and needs here. So whether that's around clear understanding of what components can be influenced by local community members on the left-hand side, you can see that that's really important, particularly as the number of projects grows. I think the really nice counterpoint here too is that being engaged when there is still time to shape important decisions, that increases dramatically depending on how many projects are happening in your local area as well, just showing that we want to know where realistically and meaningfully we can influence this process in our local area. And we see the same effect across these other items as well, whether that's having community well represented in engagement processes, seeing that individuals representing my community look like me, that actually I can see that my identity, the group that I feel like I belong to is being represented accurately in those engagement processes, also really important to everybody, but increasingly so as the number of projects increase. And also regular receipt of information about how my input was received and informed project development. So closing the loop there, we can see that 55.8% of people where there are 6 or more projects in operation are really wanting or agreeing that that's something that's important to them in terms of engagement processes. So in terms of summarising what we've got here, a couple of key things that are really important. Regulation and confidence in government to act responsibly are important for trust in developers. That's the first thing. The second is that the behaviour of developers themselves influences trust in developers and then acceptance of development projects. And then third, that we see clear, systematic and linear, in many cases, effects of the cumulative impacts of development in local contexts. And this is really great evidence for why we need to be thinking about larger frameworks that aren't just focused on individual developers or practiced by individual developers, but understanding these contexts as a geography, as a space in which multiple projects are underway. Because actually, if we manage those things effectively together, then there is going to be larger engagement with and acceptance of development in general. So they're my three key takeaways from this data set. Thanks, Kirsty.
Thanks, Kieran. Fascinating data, and so great to actually finally have some real evidence from our most impacted communities, from people who are reporting as experiencing as many as 6 projects at the one time, as to what their lived experience is and how it impacts their expectations around engagement and how they want to be approached. I think that's really powerful work. Welcome particularly to Donna Groves and to Jonathan Cartwright, who have joined us as panellists. Before we ask them for their expert opinion in just a moment on the data that we've heard from Kieren and from Sara, I wanted to just take a moment to touch on some of the fantastic questions that we've been getting in the Q&A. Now, we have been answering them as we go, but I just wanted to touch on a couple of points that were raised there. There was an important distinction around what do we mean by developer, and just for clarity, we're talking about all infrastructure proponents. So they may be private sector proponents, they may be public sector proponents, but if you have an organisation which is actively delivering and developing a project, then that's what we mean by developer in this data. We do have some very granular detail down to the specific locations where Kieren and his team were doing this work. So we picked 9 infrastructure intensive communities, metropolitan, growing regional cities and large country centres. And we'll be doing a similar exercise in South Australia, as Sara mentioned. That granular information is something that we're sharing with our partners. We're conscious that we do need to deliver that level of value to the people who are funding and providing so much active support for this work. So certainly if you're part of a partner organisation and you're wanting to see this more granular detail, wanting to access the dashboard that we've developed for you, please get in touch and we're very able to set you up with access to that information now. We are also producing a series of detailed reports, both overarching and also by theme, on this very rich data set and looking at connecting that to our other work. So you can expect to see information coming out publicly about those particular reports in the coming months. And of course, we're really looking forward to sharing even more detail through our partners at NCEIF, in person, live. I don't want to jinx it, Donna, but in person in Brisbane in June. So do come and attend that session. And I think you'll find, an even greater level of detail to help you understand the data that we're presenting today. Carmen Marshall, always fantastic to have you in the room, especially with all of your experience. And I did think that was a really interesting point, whether or not people are looking for that whole of community approach. And that it certainly seems to be where things are heading. And as we interrogate this data more, we will know more about that, and we'll be able to share that with you in terms of implications for practice. But Donna, I'd be really interested for you to pick up some of those concepts as you talk about the implications for practice. What can we do out of this data? I think those are all of the questions that we had asked and answered this morning. We do have 2 open ones. Oh yes, and of course we can give you the names of the communities. So on the East Coast,
I'm just typing those now, Kirsty, if you want, since there were so many.
That's fine. Yeah, there were.
I'll pop them in
in
the typed answers for everyone.
Perfect. Jump into the Q&A, guys. And the external effects to projects. Yes, so we did look at that. And Kieren, that's a question that I might throw to you actually, because I know we did have some interesting insights in terms of the other factors that were important to community members, both from the national data set and the local data set. Would you like to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, in these types of activities, it's always a process of trading off depth with breadth. So, given we have sort of 10 minutes, 15 minutes max with a survey instrument, we wanted to drill in lots of issues. And so that does limit the number of factors that we can accommodate, like drought, if we're looking at agriculture, or economic situation more broadly, cost of living sorts of things if we're looking at infrastructure development. Also, timing of data collection is important. So this was collected, finished collected beginning of this year, end of last year. So actually, some of these more acute cost of living issues have become more prominent in the conversation in the last couple of months after we collected the data, and that's important to understand. But then some we do. So where we have demographic characteristics that we include, we do factor those in and include them in the modelling. But typically, they get outcompeted by those other project drivers like procedural fairness and regulations and things like that, in terms of their predictive ability for trust and acceptance. So they're just much less important. So what gender you are, you might see significant differences on those things, but with respect to driving a relationship with developers and acceptance of development projects, they're much less important than those other things like responsiveness.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Kieren. I'd like to now hand over to Donna Groves, who'll be very well known to all of you. She's the driving force, together with Mel Layton, behind the National Community Engagement for Infrastructure Forum, which is on live in person on, I believe, the 1st and 2nd of June in Brisbane this year. Please go and buy your tickets if you haven't. It's such a worthwhile event, and we're looking forward to coming and presenting there. Donna, you have a wealth of experience around community engagement in the infrastructure sector. As you're hearing these results today, what occurs to you about the implications for practice?
Yeah, so first of all, the biggest thing is the $290 billion in the pipeline, the fact that the community have greater expectations around engagement. And we talk about the skills shortage with engineers and the other specialties, but we have a skills shortage in our field as well. And that's only going to get worse with that sort of pipeline and the increase in works. Really interested with some of the comments. And I know with your analysis, we talked about that the community were distracted by COVID, but they didn't lose interest in the projects. So now that COVID is moving away from the main frame, I can see people refocusing on infrastructure and greater needs for engagement. And certainly this research, the community's very clearly said, you know, we're overwhelmed, we're not really feeling heard, and you're not really engaging with us the way that we want to be engaged with. And I feel like the research is showing us very clearly that things like trader support, local economic development plans, multi-layered approaches to projects. So looking at projects where we need to work with other developers, with other government departments. And when we do have 5 or 6 projects, I see us having panels, possibly putting out joint communications, possibly doing joint information sessions, looking at our comms plan in that multi-layered, multi-project approaches, which can be difficult with different players, I understand. And I know many of us are starting to do that already. But I think that's the community's expectation. And I think to combat consultation fatigue, we can't stop consulting because they're saying they want to be communicated with more, but they want to be able to trust us as in developers and us as in government departments. So if I use the word contractor, I'm sure that can interplay with the word developer. So I made a lot of notes when we had the presentation, and I can never really read my writing, so please excuse me. But with the amount of projects increasing, I think it's the skilled comms people, and I really think we need to look at our skills, develop them, and ensure that we're putting the best people on the ground and that we have a pipeline of workers too, and it's not just the engineers that are starting to train up and understanding that we need more workers. The support for local economies, I don't think it's standard practice that our comms people are involved in developing the ED plans, the resourcing plans, trader support on the bigger projects and the mega projects. Certainly, I've had a hand in those things on the projects I'm working on, but I think that should become part of the course, and that's something that we can look at doing. The multi-project approaches, I really think we need to build cohesive planning models for multi-layered projects, and we really need to look at it not just from a regulation perspective, but from a comms perspective. I know we're mostly advocates for early engagement, but I think we use this information from the community very clearly saying we want to be engaged earlier, we want more meaningful input into projects, and we want to be truly represented, not just the loudest voices. I really liked when Kieren talked about, we want to see that someone that looks like me and thinks like me and feels like me has been asked, because then they're representing me. I know I often have concerns with projects when we're calling on people to be engaged, and I worry sometimes that we're hearing the loudest voices or those that have the time to be there, rather than truly looking at the representative views, particularly in project development. So that's part of our planning approach, and I think that's a practical implication. I think that this research gives us an impetus. It gives us reason for things that we're already asking for in project development. It says, look, this is fundamental proof of what the community is saying and what they want. So rather than getting to the point where we have projects derailed by community opposition, using this research as a reason to engage early as part of our justification. I think that COVID has changed. I mean, I'm sure it's changed all of us, but I certainly think it's changed community expectations around engagement. I don't really have any firm proof for this, but reading the research and listening to the responses, I feel like those daily presses we had in Victoria and that level of information we got around COVID, however you might feel about it, may have changed people's expectation about information and how information's delivered. I have a list of key messages that I read. When I listened to all the research and I studied, I found a list of key messages, and I'll go back to this when I'm organising my comms on big projects as well. But things that the community want to hear, and I hope we don't just say them, but they're real, are the, we're listening, we heard you. This project is part of the post-COVID economic recovery. That seemed to be very important to the community, that, you know, that in accepting a project, okay, it's contributing to the economy, it's part of the recovery. There was something when we did our summary on this research the other day, big difference between acceptance and support. Do we just want the community to accept the project, or do we want them to support it? And to support a project, we need to build trust. We need to do what we say we're going to do, and we need to communicate. There is a temptation when we're talking about consultation fatigue and construction fatigue to communicate less, but the research clearly said no, communicate more. I also really read into it, communicate more simply and more effectively and take out the politicised messages. And they want to know how the projects, why is this road getting built here? And the suspicion through the research is that it's highly politicised. Now, we may or may not have our opinions on that, but I think the point is show the procedural fairness, explain why the project, for example, you know, a major road project, it's being built because we've got growth areas here, there are more cars on the road at this point, like give the justification, because there are justifications from the business cases. And really, really came through strongly. Have the people who are being directly impacted had a say. The community really strongly thinks they should have a say and they want to know that they've had a say. So I think that could form part of our key messages, and the agency, you know, that is a really important to the community. I really get upset when I hear the community are overwhelmed and unheard, and they, you know, the lack of trust, because we try so hard, obviously, to hear. So we need to have better comms planning for that to be for people to be overwhelmed and unheard, then surely we can do better. So that's what I take as the practical implications. I take the key messages and I take that to be a genuine part of the planning. I'll definitely be looking at the skills in our team and developing our team and be ready for that pipeline, even though we are in the midst of it as well. And that early engagement, I will use this research as further justification. I'd always advocate for early engagement, the earlier the better, and in the planning process, which is certainly the space I like to work in. But this research should help us, and that genuine need to build those cohesive planning models and to work closer with our other projects. So to not just have, and we do have the, you know, cross-project fortnightly meetings, and we have those things, but maybe to a greater level and really work at our comms planning together across multiple projects that impact multiple communities. And there's no reason why information can't be more cohesive except for reasons that we've created. So that's what I've taken practically from the research, and I really look forward to seeing you at all at NCEIF. I left the dates up of the previous one there because every time I put the new dates on, COVID happens, and COVID is not happening this time. We are well on our way to selling out NCEIF in Brisbane. So please come. We do have a COVID policy where if COVID it does affect you, we do give a full refund, we understand. So you can confidently book your tickets. We have amazing speakers, including the lovely Sarah and the lovely Kirsty, but we have some great surprises as well. So we really would look forward to seeing you there. We can't wait to hold you in person, to meet you and see you in person. And I cannot tell you how these setbacks have made us more determined that this is going to be our best conference ever. So we hope to see you at NCEIF, and I hope you've got a few practical tips from the research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. I like that strategy of just leaving the old dates so that we're not in trouble. We actually had such a phenomenal week ourselves with the project last week. We were awarded the ARC research grant that we'd been hanging out for months and months and months. It cements our work for many years to come, and it lets us really take a very serious swing at the concept of social risk. And Sarah and I were having a similar conversation with ourselves. We were just going, this is too good to be true. Now what's going to happen? So I'm so relieved to see all the other Kirsty O'Connells in this morning's meeting, because these little glitches just make me feel more comfortable that I don't need to wait for the other shoe to drop. Donna, I particularly liked where you were going in terms of, you know, we need to do a better job. We need to be thinking about how we can explain to people how they've influenced the project outcome. And it actually got me thinking, I'd be interested in your view, it got me thinking that it isn't just about how the engagement practitioners do their work. It's also about creating, I think, maybe genuine feedback loops within the project environment. And I think perhaps communicating some of this work to our colleagues so that they understand what it means to project success, if we're able to genuinely take that community input in and do something with it, not just hear it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
And I wonder too whether that's about not just community, as in people living in houses in areas where there's going to be impacts, but also the larger network of stakeholders. So those that have a stake in the development of that project in a particular way. And, some really great stories that emerge in work that we're doing and with some partners in this program as well, around bringing their perspectives in for the design of infrastructure at that stage. And that may be leading to higher costs around delivery, but them signing on to be bearing some of that cost to deliver a product that is actually going to meet their needs more effectively. But the contrast between those projects where you're able to reshape, physically reshape things to meet the needs of those that are going to use it, relative to those that are developed within the standard kind of framework of this is how we build a X by government, for example, are dramatic. And I think that's where that buy-in starts. And actually that culture then pervades every part of project design and delivery, where we're not scared of bringing those perspectives in because it makes our life more complicated. In fact, we see it as an investment, as avoidance of conflict down the track, and increasing usage of that piece of infrastructure once it's delivered, rather than seeing delivery as the big tick and then move on to the next thing.
Could not agree more. That would be a dream.
Absolutely.
Yes, a dream come true.
Jonathan Cartwright, you are the Director of Policy and Research at Infrastructure Australia. You have a wealth of experience, including the Green Building Council of Australia, where you were acting as CEO the last time you were there, and then Consult Australia before that. You've had a very long-term interest in this impact of communities on infrastructure delivery and vice versa. You are leading a really interesting body of work looking at industry capability. How can we respond? Are we capable of delivering this huge $290 billion pipeline? And what does it mean for the way that we engage with communities? I would love to invite you to join this conversation and let us know what your thoughts are from the research that you've seen today.
Absolutely. Thanks. Thanks so much, Kirsty. And look, I mean, congratulations on the research and the ARC grant. It's fantastic to see that enduring support for this work, which is really critically important in understanding the role of engagement with communities and on projects in what we're seeing as an increasingly complex risk environment for the delivery of projects. I thought it might be useful just noting the context setting that you did at the outset, noting the size of the pipeline, to just give a bit of a quick snapshot of what we're seeing nationally in terms of really what that means and what it looks like visually in terms of what is often described as an unprecedented spend for infrastructure in the years ahead. But as that translates to projects and some of the constraints that we're seeing, as that creates issues within the market, both for supply and demand for materials and skills, but also the pressure it puts on the risk environment in which we're seeing infrastructure delivered. And then when we look at that risk environment, what does that mean for governments and industry in terms of how we mitigate some of these risks, and what do we think some of the key issues are from an engagement perspective in terms of managing that risk? So happy to provide that sort of preview as a precursor to discussion. We can talk about this stuff a lot at Infrastructure Australia, so I'll endeavour to keep it relatively brief as a snapshot, and hopefully create space for a few questions. But what I wanted to do on this slide was just to really demonstrate visually what that infrastructure pipeline looks like. And here we've got a breakdown of buildings, utilities and transport. You can see further to your observation around the role of rail infrastructure, but also road infrastructure as comprising some 80% of this forward pipeline, the significance of transport within the pipeline, but also all areas of activity across infrastructure sectors. And when we look at this, it looks almost like a bit of a gentle curve as you look ahead. But when you look at where we were at in 2020, when you look at some of the past levels of activity and you look ahead to 2023, what you're seeing there is basically a doubling in activity and investment over the forward years. So moving up to annual investment in major public infrastructure of $53 billion a year, which is really a doubling of what we've seen at that lower point, and far in excess of what the market's seen historically when we go back, even through that GFC period, if we take that activity further back. What I wanted to show on this slide was that what we've measured in this slide is the burgundy in this slide at the top end. So we refer to this as the major public infrastructure investment pipeline, which is projects above 50 million in the smaller jurisdictions, above 100 million in the larger jurisdictions, translates to about 220 billion over the next 5 years. And that is just that burgundy sliver that you see at the top of this slide. And that sits as about 20% of total activity when you also look at what's happening in residential building, private engineering, construction, private non-resi building. So even though we've got a doubling of investment in major public infrastructure, we're also seeing increases in investment in those other parts of engineering and construction, obviously, which has significance in terms of the issues that you're seeing with communities where they've got commercial construction, private engineering construction happening in parallel with those major projects in public infrastructure. This is just an interesting sideline. When we asked industry what they thought about this growth, they've got real concerns. The green lines indicate industry's relative level of comfort and confidence in their ability to deliver a growth of around 10 to 17% relative to a very low level of confidence in their ability to deliver growth when it hits that 30% year-on-year mark, which is what we're seeing over the forward years. So industry itself, as much as we love, lots of projects coming to market, the reality is the pace of growth is outstripping industry's confidence in their ability to match that growth with the skills and resources available. And I think we're seeing that in the market. We mapped through this work last year, supply against demand, and this is relevant for everyone that works in infrastructure. So we're anticipating when we look at supply of skills in the green line versus demand for those skills in the brown line, we can see the gap. And that gap translates in 23 to what we estimate to be over 100,000 roles unfilled. So 1 in 3 roles on major infrastructure projects going unfilled over that forward period. So creating, again, some real issues when we look at infrastructure delivery and crystallised risk on projects and risk as it relates to escalation in costs, project delays for a whole range of reasons, which again is a good context, I think, from a risk perspective in terms of some of the additional risks that are faced alongside social licence. This goes, I think, to the heart of some of the issues that you guys have flagged through your research, which is this increasing concentration of projects at a local level, particularly at a metro level. 39% of all mega projects having at least one other mega project within 5 kilometres, 91% within 200 kilometres, but really goes to the heart of the data as you're seeing it in terms of the increasing pressures for communities around that pipeline as it's delivered geographically. This is the risk context. So how does that all translate? Well, it translates into a really complex risk environment. And we all know that projects go over budget. Australia is not alone in that story. Our data indicates, globally, 75% of projects are delivered over budget. And all of these, all of the context in terms of that pipeline of projects and the pressures we're seeing in the market contribute to that, as well as a host of other issues when we look at the health of the infrastructure sector more generally, whether we're looking at commercial models and deliverability and risk allocation, etc. I wanted to just give a snapshot of this because in addition to those issues that you are identifying in terms of social license and community engagement, which we can see in the top right, these are all of the other risks that we identify across infrastructure projects which contribute to some of those issues that we see in terms of cost escalation or project delays or blowouts, whether it's climate risk or contractor issues, utilities risks that were unknown. This risk landscape is an important one because it's one in which those social license and engagement issues are part of the picture, but an increasingly important part of that risk picture as we look to manage these risks in project delivery and management. So what does all that mean? Well, we do a few things at Infrastructure Australia. So we assess business cases for infrastructure projects and deliver the National Infrastructure Priority List. We monitor market conditions and capacity, which is that work that I outlined. And alongside that, within the policy and research team, we deliver reform recommendations for governments to improve productivity, delivery and quality of life off the back of the infrastructure that we're delivering. I wanted to flag that as part of the Australian Infrastructure Plan, as we delivered it in September last year, within our chapter on sustainability and resilience, we include a very specific recommendation that goes to the heart of how we build community trust in infrastructure decision-making. And for anyone working in that sector, I urge you to read this chapter just to be aware of our positioning and recommendations as they pertain to that. So this recommendation is the headline recommendation, but underneath this sits 4 outcomes that we're seeking within that recommendation. And within that, another 13 direct and practical activities for governments and key stakeholders to take forward to deliver that recommendation and ultimately improve community trust in infrastructure, whether that's around embedding quadruple bottom line or place-based community, providing timely and clear information. I mean, all of this would be familiar to many of you and probably doesn't seem seismic in terms of it being a pretty practical and pragmatic approach to how we should be working with engagement more effectively on our infrastructure projects, but is significant because it's not happening well all the time, and we need to pursue this kind of reform agenda and continue to pursue it to ensure that these risks are effectively mitigated. And it includes those activities that, again, is what we think needs to be happening on projects, whether it's around standardised engagement through all assurance project stages, again, that ESG, or activity 2.3.1.4, which really goes to the heart of what Sarah and Kirsty are taking forward with this work, which is really critical. This is just some of the activities within the plan. I urge you to read it. Always happy to speak to it and our broader work on social license. But look, my congratulations on the research. Certainly it's something that we're looking forward to working collaboratively with you on and looking at how we can integrate it with our work more broadly, particularly as we look at risk. But yeah, a really critical discussion to keep progressing, I think, as we take it all forward and try and get better outcomes from our infrastructure.
Jonathan, terrific job. I always feel like I learn a lot every time you walk into a room. So I'm glad you're here today. And I think we would be very keen to have a discussion with you around the idea of engagement standards across assurance phases. As you know, and for the benefit of everyone else in the room, having developed the infrastructure engagement excellence standards, we have also started to go through the process of then mapping that standards across the gateway assurance processes for each state. So we're now in a position to have a really strong understanding of where our standards marry up with the gateway reviews process, and we're also looking at other mainstream quality assurance standards like ISCA, so that we're able to have a standard that's achieves more than one objective and that really relates to the other mainstream assurance exercises that people might be going through. So definitely opening the door for that conversation over the coming weeks and months. Some questions that have come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in there because following on to that, there's a really terrific question in the chat around, does this all suggest that we should be doing more social performance measurement? And how does the community engagement component link into the social impact assessment component? for example. And I know that we've got Richard Parsons from New South Wales in the room, and so he'll probably be going, yay, we're going to talk about this. There is a lot of work to be done in thinking both about how we better shape social impact assessment at the front end of projects as it's traditionally been regulated, in order to better capture the cumulative impacts that we see from this data are genuinely affecting communities' experiences of projects. There's some really terrific work going on with the CENVP, so the Center for Environmental Management Performance. I'm always going to get their acronym wrong, but they have the only environmental practitioners certification in Australia. And there is a group of us now who are working on a similar certification for social impact assessors. So all of this conversation is happening within a really important context where we are trying to improve the professional standards for the social side of these major projects. And one of our partners, the International Association for Public Participation, is probably very well known to the attendees here today, and their guidelines and processes as well serve as a really important touch point for the quality of engagement that communities experience. And certainly I think we do have more work to do to think about how we can, particularly working with governments and regulators, develop a more consistent and clear approach to what's expected for community engagement around major projects, and also to improve the integration and recognition of cumulative impact assessment for community members. I'd really like to see a community-centric approach to these things, as opposed to a traditional project by project approach. Thanks, Kirsty.
Thanks, Sarah. That was a great chip in. So yeah, I think that's a fantastic segue also into a couple more questions for you, Jonathan. I'm really interested in this concept of market capacity and whether or not we actually do have the skill sets and the mechanisms in place. And I think what you're suggesting is that perhaps we don't have the support mechanisms in place, and particularly in terms of policy, to be able to manage the burden that's on industry at the moment, and also to help industry deal with the complexities of delivering even more infrastructure in an even smaller area, in a more geographically tight area. Would you like to take a little chip at that?
Yeah, I mean, the constraints that we're seeing are really significant. I mean, those skills constraints alone, I think, anyone working in infrastructure, and you talk to, I was on a panel yesterday talking to, hearing from Joe Barr from John Holland talking about, skills are the #1 issue for industry in terms of being able to deliver. And I think that's going to continue for the foreseeable future. And that skills, we mapped 50 occupations and 34 out of those 50 are likely or potentially or currently in shortage. So it's not just engineers, to your point, it's across all occupational groupings that go to infrastructure delivery, and there's a heavy concentration across the East Coast and a heavy concentration in metropolitan areas. What that means though, I think, it's easy to be negative and say, hands up, can't manage this, too much work, too many projects. And I think actually what we need to do is look at the opportunity this pipeline presents to do things better, to work smarter, and to deliver greater value for money and productivity. Productivity in construction is the lowest of any sector in the economy. And we know, working in infrastructure, the very significant cultural issues that exist across the sector, the opportunities to improve productivity, whether that's through better risk allocation, contracting methods, use of digital technologies, better engagement with communities, better attraction and retention of workers, better health and wellbeing outcomes. So what we advocated what we released 2 weeks ago was a report called Delivering Outcomes. And that report outlines what we see as an opportunity to really for a step change in the whole sector across all of those facets. because we need to make it a better place to work. We need to work more collaboratively between government and industry to improve those outcomes we get for people on the ground. And we need to see this pipeline as an opportunity to deliver infrastructure in a smarter way. And we can do that. So I think we need to focus on the opportunities.
Jonathan, I'm not surprised being you, but I'm pleased that you mentioned the word collaboratively. And when I look at the question from Carmen Marshall around what communities expect around legacy and community benefits, and when I think about the outcomes and some of the results that we saw coming in through this piece of work, where communities have made it really clear that, and particularly in regional areas, the data was showing us that communities are very interested in the economic benefits of infrastructure projects, particularly post-pandemic. They are also very interested in real local benefits. It strikes me, and so I'm going to try and stitch together a few other things that have come in. So we've heard that communities, and particularly highly impacted communities, want earlier engagement, that they really want to be involved while there's time to influence the process. We know from other pieces of work that we're doing that stakeholder and community pressure is still extremely impactful to project delay. And of course, project delay is one of those things that can then drive costs, that can then contribute to some of the contractor fails that we've seen, and which your team has been writing about recently. Do you think, when we're thinking about that word collaboratively, that we can do more about actually bringing communities into the selection and planning phases of projects, and without that just being sort of a buzzword or a feel-good exercise? Do you see that there are practical opportunities to do that, and for that collaboration to include the future users of the infrastructure we're building and the communities which will host it?
Yeah, I absolutely. And it's a really critical element, both to build support, but also to identify those infrastructure solutions or other solutions to the problems that we're trying to deal with. And when we look at some of the issues, and some of our recommendations around building resilience specifically, I think that engagement with communities to understand what the local solutions are to some of those challenges is absolutely critical to investing in the right way and making the right decisions. I think a really practical action that we've taken in recent years that goes to the heart of that is to broaden our assessment framework as it informs business case development on infrastructure, to expand the focus beyond a cost benefit number, which is always the headline that makes it into the papers, but which often fails to capture those broader benefits that are most tangible for the communities most affected by that infrastructure. So in our new assessment framework, we've included guidelines to create a narrative through a business case that better explores the quality of life benefits or the sustainability and resilience benefits for those communities affected, so that we can have those stories that explain infrastructure, not just from an economic perspective in terms of cost benefit, but in terms of those less easily quantifiable benefits that are really meaningful for communities over the longer term. So I think something as simple as that is a better business case and a better communicated business case, both in its development and in its sell back to the community, is a really practical way of delivering some of that.
Fantastic. Donna, I'm going to throw this next question to you. I think this might be one that you have some thoughts on, particularly in terms of engagement, because that's largely our audience today, and the people who are in those community-facing roles, trying to build trust and trying to bring feedback in. Do you see any effort being made across the industry to work with government to increase the skill set of the workforce and to ensure that we actually do have a pipeline of engagement professionals who can help us to address the challenges that we have in front of us?
I do see some effort. I don't see enough, and I'm really passionate about developing engagement professionals. I'm also really passionate about us not being seen, and it has changed. It's 30 years in this profession. I was the only female on site 30 years ago, and things have changed a lot, and we're not a dinosaur anymore. But in some ways, what Jonathan says does ring true, because there's still a little component that sees the comms people as admin people, or they don't see us as qualified as the enviro specialists or the other specialists, and that's particularly with the developers or the contractors and on site. There tends to be a little bit more respect for our skills within government, and I'm generalising, and there's way exceptions to the rule, so please nobody take offence. If you're in the front facing roles like I am, I'm sure you've felt the same way, but it's our responsibility to push back. It's our responsibility to use this research, and the greatest impetus for progress and development of respect for our position is when things do go wrong and we fix it. So when there are examples of the problems, unfortunately, that's the impetus to get the extra staff, to get more skilled staff. But there still is pushback at a developer level to pay for IAP2 training, to pay for basic qualifications. And having a comms degree makes you a fantastic writer, but we need skills around issue resolution. We need front-facing skills. And then a lot of our team, and I have a planning degree, a lot of our team are doing planning and environmental qualifications or doing shorter courses so they understand the bigger picture and working in development. And I'd encourage my fellow professionals to work in development of projects and construction of projects, because that's where we have the greatest impact, is when we have the understanding. So if we're working at projects from that grassroots development level, when you're looking at route options, that helps. But yes, in answer to your questions, we have more respect as a profession, and that certainly assists with us being developed. But we don't have enough of an accreditation. And Sarah, that's the first I've heard of you working on that accreditation. And I say, bring it on. Do you need funding? Do you need support? Bring it on, because yeah, we certainly get the respect on the projects a lot more than what we used to, but respect not being an ego-driven, respect being we are a real profession. We know what we're doing, we can help, and we've got genuine representation for the community and the client, and we're not salespeople. But it has developed, it's better. So I'm probably talking to you about old things, but there's still some of that.
No, I think there's still a bit of that going on, Donna.
I did spend yesterday training the entire Western Roads upgrade team in community engagement, right down from their traffic controllers all the way through, giving them techniques in issues resolution and talking to them about engagement in terms of, contractual liability and what the right thing to do with the community. So that's amazing. That wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. So I have to remember where we've come from, but there's still some place to go. We are very experienced at what we do, and we are very necessary. And yes, I'm a big voice for that, hence NCEIF.
Which you should all go to.
Yes.
On whatever dates it occurs, which we will not mention so we don't jinx it, but it is soon, and we're all looking forward to it in Brisbane. Yeah, Donna, look, couldn't agree more. And organizations like the International Association for Impact Assessment, with which I've worked for many years, and now here with CENVP and the SIA certification, there is a lot of work still to be done around legitimacy of both community engagement as a profession and social impact assessment. And so we think that this is a really, really important step on the professional side of the coin towards building that legitimacy. Yes, and those dates for NCEIF are in the chat, but not from Donna. So it's not jinxed. Kirsty, thanks.
Guys, I would love to give, we do have a couple of minutes left. I have a couple of very brief plugs to make at the end, but before I do that, I'd love to give our panelists the opportunity for one final buy into this discussion, and particularly if you have a take-home message for our audience. And I might just go left to right. Sarah, have you got a few words that you'd like to close on?
Thanks so much, Kirsty, and thanks to everyone for giving your time to be here today for what we feel is an incredibly important discussion, both for the infrastructure sector and for the Australian communities who are currently impacted. What we're seeing, I think, is a perfect storm potentially of three things. We've seen throughout the pandemic, and we've got other data that supports this, a buildup of project delays. We are also seeing that maintained emphasis on project fast tracking and ramping up, And then we're seeing today at the very individual community level, the results of cumulative impacts. And Jonathan's graphic that he showed with that overlapping circle of mega projects, it really demonstrates that Australian communities, they're fatigued from the pandemic. Now we've got all these financial issues. Then you've got multiple infrastructure projects in one place. People are worn down and they're seeing projects as politicized. And so I think the message to take away is now is the time to engage communities. Now is the time to really genuinely adopt community-centered infrastructure planning and development, and to really hear these voices before we start to see increased protest as people start to return to normal and have the capacity to engage. Thanks, Kirsty.
Thanks, Sarah. Donna, would you like to say a few words to finish?
I think I've been passionate enough as usual, but just use the research for the impetus to get the results that you need to do better engagement in person. Look, I speak to my colleagues all the time from all across the industry, and I know we genuinely do want to engage early and do it right and inform, and we do want to do the right thing by the community. And I think this research helps us justify our position. And let's get the junior people skilled, let's get them moving up, let's get them specialists in infrastructure, because we are our own field and we require unique skills and unique training, and we need more people in this industry, because I don't plan on still doing this at 80, and we need other people coming through.
Fantastic, me either. Jonathan, do you have a few words for our audience?
I mean, one thing I didn't say, which was that while this is a boom, we see it as a new normal of elevated activity. So, you know, let's view this as an opportunity to do things better. Engagement is a critical part of that, and I think overlays all of those risks that we're seeing across projects. So let's get the data to create the evidence to make the change in how governments approach these issues and work more collaboratively with industry. But, you know, applaud the research and look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you, and we look forward to your continued involvement as well. Kieran, would you like to wrap up this event for us? You've done some fantastic work with us on this, and we're really interested.
Yeah, look, no pressure there. I guess for me, there's one clear theme that runs across the levels of data that we've been collecting in this space, and that is responsive developers, responsiveness in the development process, where communities are not just being told they're being listened to, but that input is shaping the nature of the projects that in most cases are being developed for their benefit, is fundamentally important to social license. But more than that, what we can see here is there's a strong business case for doing this, and that has value in a number of dimensions. So reducing the cost of delays that community conflict throws up, you know, bringing more resources to bear in terms of funding resources to bear to fund projects that are really demonstrating high ESG standards, and also, I guess, in this context where we seem to be resource constrained around workforce and workers in these industries, that in fact doing these things better is a clear signal to the employees of companies that this is the place they want to work. And I think to be competitive in this space, in collecting and bringing together the best people for the delivery of these projects, that these are key attributes and characteristics that employees are looking for and looking at to know whether this is the place where they want to work, where they're going to treat communities with respect and bring them along for the journey. So, you know, I think there's lots of good reasons and there's lots of good hard-edged data to bring into the decision spaces that determine budgets, that determine approach, values, principles, frameworks within companies and across an industry that supports the sort of outcomes we've all been describing. Thanks, Kirsty.
Thank you, Kieren. Just a few points to wrap up, guys, and I do appreciate that we're slightly over time, so I understand if people need to go to various meetings. We do have a fantastic follow-up event to this. What you've heard today is part of the community perspective. So at the end of April, we will be bringing you the results from the 4th State of Infrastructure and Engagement Survey to provide the other side of the coin in this, the industry perspective. As to what's been happening in the delivery of Australia's $290 billion infrastructure pipeline. That will be on Friday, the 29th of April. If you'd like to mark it in your diaries, there is an Eventbrite page already open for this event. So do feel free to register for that one. We'd love to have you at it. Please look out for ongoing releases, reports, webinars from this particular body of work from Australian Perspectives on Infrastructure. And we do look forward to extending this work in the coming year. So we certainly will be looking at some of the questions that were posed today, because there were some excellent points raised and some items there that I think that we can really look at in future iterations of this survey to make sure that we continue to deliver research which is absolutely industry relevant. Jonathan, Donna, Kieren and Sarah, thank you so much for your expertise, and thank you to everyone in the audience for participating in this. We will be posting the video from today's event on the Australian National University Crawford School YouTube site, and I will circulate the details of that to all of our registered participants as soon as it's available. Thank you again, and look forward to seeing you at our next event.